Hey guys, tonight we journey into the quiet, ink-stained corners of an empire that somehow functioned for over 1,000 years by writing everything, and I mean everything, in purple. Not lavender, not violet, but that deep, royal, borderline obsessive shade of Tyrian purple that you absolutely could not afford unless you were born with a crown hovering near your cradle. You're in the middle of Constantinople now, where bureaucrats sweat under gold-threaded robes, their quills dripping purple ink that costs more than your rent, while they draft documents you'd need a full afternoon nap just to finish reading. You can practically hear the scratching of feather quills against parchment, the muttered complaints about ink shortages, and the occasional nervous gulp when a minor misspelling might send someone to exile in a monastery. This is not going to be thrilling. It's going to be slow, glacial, and you probably won't survive this if you're hoping for action scenes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts with a color, Tyrian purple. Made from the glands of thousands of sea snails, this dye was so expensive and time-consuming to produce that by the time it became a staple of the Byzantine elite, it was basically currency. And not just any currency, a shimmering, staining mark of power. You, lucky imaginary listener, have just received a scroll sealed with a drop of wax and scribbled in imperial purple. Congratulations. You're either about to be promoted, or politely executed. But the ink, yes, the ink. It wasn't just symbolic. In the Byzantine Empire, purple ink was reserved almost exclusively for imperial documents. You couldn't just stroll into the market and pick up a bottle. It was painstakingly crafted from murex mollusks fished off the coast of Phoenicia. One mollusk produced maybe a single drop. That meant gallons required fields of crushed sea life, rotting under the sun. The smell was unbearable. But the ink? Divine. Permanent. And terribly intimidating when it appeared on your tax notice. The phrase written in purple wasn't a figure of speech. It was a mark of legitimacy, an imperial fingerprint. No ordinary clerk would dare touch it. Only the emperor, or someone close enough to smell his bathwater, could issue decrees in that royal hue. The parchment too had to be dyed purple, and the letters painted in liquid gold or silver. Historians still argue whether these lavish materials were used for their spiritual symbolism, sheer intimidation, or simply because emperors were high-key addicted to aesthetic overkill. Now imagine being the poor scribe tasked with painting Latin or Greek script, usually in all caps, no punctuation, and no spacing, with trembling hands on dyed parchment that cost more than your cousin's house. You sneeze? That's 2 weeks' salary gone. A single smudge? Welcome to a new career as a monk in Armenia. But it wasn't just about making things look good. Purple carried meaning that went deep into the empire's bones. It represented power, yes, but also divine sanction. The Byzantines didn't just think their emperors ruled with God's blessing, they thought they practically co-signed with him. To write in purple was to borrow the authority of heaven and press it into law. That might seem ridiculous today, but picture this. You're a peasant who's never seen a book, barely understands the taxman, and suddenly you receive a glowing purple document sealed with the double-headed eagle. You don't question it. You pay. Or you run, very fast, into the countryside. And there's more. Purple ink became a class barrier. To own a document written in purple was to possess something sacred. Some religious texts were transcribed this way, particularly Gospels, and monasteries guarded them like dragon treasure. There's a copy of the Gospels of Rossano, a 6th century manuscript entirely written on purple-dyed vellum with silver ink. Scholars call it breathtaking. Most scribes probably called it a hand cramp that never healed. Even the production of purple was tightly controlled. The dye was regulated by law. Forging it wasn't just frowned upon, it was treason. There are whispers and dusty records of artisans who tried to make imitation purple from berries and indigo. They didn't last long. One was supposedly caught selling bootleg dye to a merchant and ended up as a cautionary tale, though whether he was fined, flogged, or flung into the Bosphorus is up for debate. And yet, for all its power, purple ink couldn't save the empire from decay. You'll see that across the next few hours. Bureaucrats clinging to rules, scrolls piling up, laws becoming more ornate than practical. But in the beginning, when purple first touched parchment, it meant something. It meant fear, authority, empire. Oh, and fun fact, In the later centuries, some emperors tried to stretch their purple supply with additives like wine, beetroot juice, and berry extract. The result? Documents that smelled fantastic but faded in the sun. So, the next time your printer runs out of magenta, just remember, at least you didn't have to boil mollusks in your kitchen for the privilege. You've seen the ink, thick, royal, smugly purple. But now you're led, quietly and barefoot across a polished marble hallway, to a chamber wrapped in silence and velvet shadows. At its heart, a low-ceilinged room paneled in polished porphyry. That deep, wine-dark stone glistens even in low lamplight. You are standing in the porphyra, the imperial birthing chamber of the great palace of Constantinople. If you were lucky enough, strategic enough, to be born here, you earned a title that wrapped you in reverence for the rest of your life. Porphyrogenitos, born in the purple. It sounds poetic, and it was, but also painfully literal. The Byzantines built this room entirely of purple marble not for luxury, but to establish a chain of legitimacy so shiny and unbreakable that it could outlast civil war, court gossip, and even an emperor who couldn't read. If your umbilical cord dropped onto porphyry, that meant you were the real deal. Not some late addition. Not a convenient nephew. But born of a ruling emperor and empress during their reign. A purple baby for a purple empire. And yes, empress, too. Unlike many of their Western counterparts, Byzantine women, especially in the imperial family, were often powerful players in succession drama. Some even ruled in their own right. And if a baby was born to a reigning empress, you bet that purple birthing room would get cleaned so thoroughly you could eat figs off the floor. Prestige was a thing, but symbolism was everything. Even your placenta, if you were imperial, was probably treated with more protocol than a mid-level provincial governor. Historians still argue whether the porphyra was used for every imperial birth or only ceremonially. There's also a debate over whether the purple marble came from Egypt, the Greek Isles, or was reused from earlier Roman monuments, as the Byzantines were known to be excellent recyclers of both building materials and ideologies. But what's not up for debate is the sheer impact of being born in the purple. It meant other aristocrats, even your own older siblings, had to walk on eggshells around you. You could be third in line for the throne, but if you had the porphyry pedigree, suddenly your cousins started sending you extra candy dates at feast days. You were dangerous in the most charming, ceremonial way. But let's not pretend this was all magic and marble. Being born in the purple didn't guarantee you keep your head, literally or politically. The Byzantine court was a chessboard soaked in honey and poison. Plenty of purple-borns were exiled, blinded, or mysteriously vanished into monasteries after being urged to reflect. One particularly unlucky Porphyrogenitos, Constantine Doukas, had barely learned to write his name before getting replaced by a general with better handwriting and a bigger army. And yes, handwriting mattered, because what followed the purple birth was a life drowning in scrolls, signatures, and imperial visibility. You couldn't just fade into the background when your birth was a public event complete with bells, incense, and probably a small army of bureaucrats ready to start documenting your expenses. From day one, your every cough became a footnote. One slip, one awkward gesture, and the nobles would whisper that perhaps you weren't quite purple enough after all. Even your toys would be weirdly ceremonial. Some records suggest that imperial toddlers were given golden rattles or lead seals to chew on, because nothing says future emperor like nibbling on state documents. Later, you'd be educated in rhetoric, law, and theology, because a good emperor needed to sermonize and sue, preferably in Greek. But the most fascinating part? The way Byzantines clung to the myth of purple birth even when reality peeled away. During times of crisis, usurpers and generals often married into purple-born bloodlines just to add shimmer to their claim. Some went further and forged documents claiming their children had been born in the porphyra, even shipping in purple marble for private birthing chambers elsewhere. Fake purple rooms. Imagine that. One emperor, Romanos IV Diogenes, wasn't born in the purple, but married a widow who had been. Her sons were porphyrogenitoi. Romanos made sure they were always seated next to him in court, like sparkly legal shields against rebellion. Didn't work. He still got overthrown. But A+4 aesthetic. There's also something incredibly modern about it all, don't you think? The obsession with place of birth, status symbols, gold-trimmed baby photos. The Byzantine elite were doing gender reveals with state-funded mosaics while the rest of the world was still figuring out plumbing. And speaking of mosaics, you'll see them throughout the palace, glittering with bits of purple glass, tiny tesserae that catch lamplight like trapped stars. Those weren't just decoration. They were propaganda. The emperor always stood front and center, a halo around his head, flanked by saints and soldiers, and usually a small, serene child with a suspiciously symmetrical face. That child was the heir. And you better believe the caption underneath included some reference to his purple birth. It wasn't just art, it was a kind of contract. One that said, "This child was born here, among marble and incense and silence, with the weight of empire poured over his cradle like oil. He has the ink, the marble, the blood. Obey him." The Byzantines, for all their complexity, knew this one truth: if you want people to believe in something, wrap it in purple, name it in Greek, and swear it's older than time. And maybe, just maybe, it'll last until morning. You're standing now in a narrow, candlelit hallway that smells like wax, old books, and the faintest trace of rose oil. Just ahead, a door creaks open, not dramatically, just enough to let out the quiet sigh of parchment. You step into a room filled with the softest murmurs and the scratch of goosefeather on calfskin. Welcome to the scriptorium, the Byzantine Empire's most underappreciated pressure cooker. This is where the real machinery of power hummed, slowly, silently, with a lot of ink smudges and eye strain. Forget swords and spears. Here, the weapons are styluses, ink pots, and an aggressive sense of formatting. The men in this room, yes, mostly men, are not warriors, but they can make or unmake entire provinces with a comma, which, by the way, didn't officially exist yet. Their job? Copy imperial decrees, draft legislation, rewrite old scrolls, translate everything from Latin to Greek and back again, and make it all legible to someone who probably hasn't held a pen since his coronation day. You wouldn't think of scribes as dangerous, but these were some of the most trusted, and most feared, workers in the entire empire. They had access to secrets. The kind of secrets that weren't supposed to make it past the gold leaf margins. Changes in taxation. Orders to imprison a rival. Edits to imperial succession plans. You mess up one vowel? The wrong person gets promoted. You accidentally leave off a phrase? Suddenly, the Bishop of Antioch loses his land grant. And sometimes, scribes weren't just copyists. Sometimes, they were fixers. Historians still argue whether these scribes function more like civil servants or intelligence agents. Some say they merely transcribed what was handed down. Others believe they often shaped policy by deciding how something was worded, and whether a document ever made it to the emperor's eyes at all. One clerk with a particularly steady hand and a grudge could change history with a well-timed footnote. And don't forget the hierarchy. Oh, there was always a hierarchy. At the top were the imperial secretaries, chartularioi, who operated so close to the throne they could smell the emperor's anxiety. They were the ones who oversaw foreign correspondence, managed internal communications, and signed off on official decrees. Below them? A cascade of junior scribes, parchment runners, seal makers, and, yes, ink grinders. If you were new, your job was literally to stir powdered pigments into vinegar for 12 hours and hope you didn't spill it on your robes. And speaking of ink, did you know the Byzantines developed over a dozen types for different purposes? Everyday documents used a basic carbon black. Important religious or state proclamations got the special treatment: purple ink, silver ink, sometimes even a blend of ochre and crushed ruby for a pinkish glow that made your eyes twitch if you looked at it too long. Quirky tidbit? One batch of imperial ink once went moldy during shipment to a military outpost. The resulting fungal script became known as the Stinking Scroll and had to be recopied by a poor monk with nose plugs and a bad attitude. But even with all this control, the system wasn't foolproof. Forgeries happened. A particularly famous case involved a document declaring a tax exemption for a monastery, which didn't exist. Turns out a mid-tier scribe had created the forgery, sealed it with a stolen imperial stamp, and retired to the countryside with a suspicious number of goats. The scandal took years to unravel and ended with at least 3 reassigned bishops and 1 mysteriously vanished goat farmer. Still, for most scribes, the life was as slow and repetitive as the handwriting it required. You sat for hours, day after day, often in silence, copying out law codes so intricate they made your dreams rhyme in Byzantine legalese. One unlucky clerk spent 27 years working on a single updated version of the Nomo Canon, only to have it rendered obsolete by a new emperor 2 weeks before publication. That's the bureaucratic version of finishing a puzzle and watching a pigeon fly off with the final piece. To pass the time, some scribes doodled in the margins, little sketches of saints with suspiciously large noses, sarcastic rabbits, or bored angels holding scrolls that read, "I'm so tired." These weren't just silly distractions, they were pressure valves. A way for exhausted minds to process the grind of perfection demanded by a system that barely remembered their names. And you, dear listener, are seated now among them. Your quill trembles. Your fingers are ink-stained. You just misspelled hegemon for the third time. You glance over your shoulder, but the protonotarios, the head scribe, is napping, his wig tilted back, snoring softly under the flicker of an oil lamp. You take a risk. In the corner of the page, just outside the margin, you draw a tiny peacock in sandals. You feel a thrill. Rebellion. The Byzantine bureaucratic machine ran not on inspiration, but endurance. And this scriptorium, silent, methodical, candlelit, was its heart. You were writing for yourself. You were carving memory into calfskin, etching law into the bones of the empire. Whether anyone would read it or not was another matter. But still, every line mattered. Because one day, centuries from now, some wide-eyed scholar, or, let's be honest, a very tired podcaster, would stumble across your scroll, read your neat Greek lettering, and whisper, "Wow, this guy really hated margins." The sound in this next room is different. Less scratchy, more hushed. Fabric swishing, a soft clank of gold bracelets, the faint echo of sandals brushing marble. You're not in the scriptorium anymore. You're in the quarters of someone whose words never touched purple ink, yet often dictated the direction of its flow. Welcome to the Empress's private chambers, where wax tablets, whispered alliances, and a talent for quiet manipulation turned domestic life into something far more strategic. Byzantine women, especially those of the imperial court, weren't just ornamental figures tucked behind veils and curtains. Many were powerful, educated, and deeply involved in the mechanics of rule. And while men held the pens that signed the edicts, women often supplied the thoughts that shaped them. With a tilt of the head or a few words scribbled into a wax tablet, an empress could steer an empire. Take Theodora, for example, not the saint, but the street performer turned empress who married Justinian I in the 6th century. She didn't sit back and embroider cushions. She co-ruled, issued laws, argued with bishops. She also probably had access to the imperial wax boards, flat, polished wooden tablets coated with a layer of dark beeswax used for drafting messages, notes, or, occasionally, plans that weren't meant to last. You'd write with a stylus, erase with the blunt end, and burn the whole thing if the gossip got too spicy. These wax tablets were the DMs of their day, quick to compose, easy to destroy, and deeply private. Empresses and noblewomen used them to communicate with allies, scribes, and even foreign envoys. Unlike scrolls, which were ceremonially unrolled in front of witnesses, wax messages could be passed quietly between sleeves, under trays of figs, or tucked into hollowed-out books. Historians still argue whether women like Theodora or Irene of Athens ever penned state policy themselves or merely influenced it from behind scented curtains. But the fact remains, they were involved. Sometimes, visibly. Irene, for instance, crowned herself emperor, not empress, after blinding her own son to prevent him from taking the throne. That's not influence. That's a corporate takeover with candles. And while we're on candles, imagine the scene, a small study, late at night, lit by just 2 flames. An empress sits at a low table, her stylus scratching faintly as she writes notes in wax. The air smells of rosewater and old parchment. There's a bowl of dates nearby, half-eaten. A folded scrap of silk hides a seal, her own crest, a dove wrapped in ivy. She taps it gently against the table. Somewhere beyond the heavy curtain, the court still believes she's asleep. These small domestic tools, wax boards, ribbons, seal rings, weren't trivial. They were instruments of subtle power. While men shouted at each other in the Senate Hall, women like Zoe, Anakamine, and Eudokia Macremolatissa built alliances over tea, or plotted coups, or issued orders to generals through carefully worded letters disguised as invitations to dinner. Fringe tidbit: one letter from a noblewoman in the 10th century was discovered tucked inside a child's toy horse. It included not only coded instructions for managing an estate, but also a prayer for the safe return of her secret lover. Romantic? Maybe. Terrifyingly efficient? Absolutely. And yet, this level of discretion came at a cost. Mistakes could be deadly. If a wax tablet fell into the wrong hands, There was no encryption, no login screen, just soft wax and a stylus mark. Some empresses, according to legend, developed their own shorthand to obscure their writing, or simply gave verbal orders through trusted eunuchs. Ah yes, eunuchs, another Byzantine invention that deserves its own late-night episode. In short, they were some of the most powerful intermediaries in the empire, often educated, discreet, and fiercely loyal to whoever had promoted them. For empresses, they were messengers, confidants, bodyguards, and political operatives rolled into one. Some eunuchs even headed entire ministries, delivering wax tablets straight to the emperor's lap without anyone in the court ever knowing who'd really written them. And while we're here, let's not forget Anna Komnene, princess, historian, and arguably the empire's most famous female writer. Her Alexiad chronicled her father's reign in obsessive detail, complete with side-eye toward rival generals and heartfelt laments about being passed over for power. She wasn't just scribbling family memories, she was shaping the legacy of the Komnenos dynasty one sentence at a time. All from her chamber, surrounded by books and candles and a bitterness you could practically spoon onto bread. Women in the Byzantine court weren't silent. They just spoke through layers of wax, of metaphor, of proximity to power. They navigated a world designed to sideline them with such grace and menace that sometimes, no one realized who was actually running the show. And as you sit now in the Empress's chamber, maybe you catch the scent of jasmine drifting from her robes, see the slight smirk as she folds a note into silk. She rings a tiny bell. A eunuch arrives. No words are exchanged. He bows and leaves. Somewhere else, a general gets a letter. He'll read it, nod, and assume it came from the Emperor's council. It didn't. It came from here. Because the wax remembers, but only until the fire is lit. Now you drift through a long corridor, guided by the sound of sandals on stone, until a heavy bronze door creaks open and you step into something vast and echoing, a space that doesn't feel like a room so much as a quiet maze of history. You're inside the great palace of Constantinople. It doesn't scream grandeur, it purrs it, with walls inlaid with porphyry and serpentine, ceilings vaulted in gold mosaic, and columns so finely carved they seem almost too delicate to support their own smug elegance. They called it the Magnum Palladium, and it was less a building than a city within a city. Twisting halls, courtyards, bathing chambers, chapels, treasury vaults, secret gardens, and pigeon coops, not to mention the bureaucratic offices that churned out decrees, tax codes, and the occasional royal pardon. It was a place so large and layered that people who lived there often got lost, and couriers were known to carry little wax maps to find the right stairwell. You, tonight, are wandering it barefoot in the lamplight. At its peak, the great palace sprawled over 200,000 square meters. Historians still argue how much of that was actually used daily, and how much was just glorified storage space for relics, costumes, and backup thrones. And yes, there were multiple thrones. You needed options. One for court, one for councils, one possibly padded for long meetings. And don't even get started on the traveling throne, which was essentially a foldable drama chair with its own mule. But behind the pageantry, the palace was a hive of activity. Clerks trotted between rooms with scrolls tucked under their arms, whispering updates like nervous pigeons. Pages fetched warm wine and slippers for aristocrats who hadn't read a full page of legislation since the Justinian plague. Eunuchs guarded doors that led to places no one admitted existed. And in the middle of it all sat the emperor, technically the center of the universe, practically a man surrounded by people pretending to cough whenever he asked hard questions. If you've ever wondered how an empire so vast kept functioning without smartphones or spreadsheets, the answer is, barely. Much of it depended on the palace functioning as a factory for forms. Edicts were drafted in the secretariat, reviewed in the consistorium, rubber-stamped by someone named Leo or Basil or Euthemios, and finally walked across half a mile of mosaic floor to be sealed in the ink hall. And yes, there was a literal ink hall. A whole room where ink was stored, tested, and guarded. Because nothing says imperial efficiency like locking up your blue-black supply behind 2 armed guards and a curtain made of embroidered silk. This was where they mixed the fabled purple ink too, right down to the drop. A clerk once spilled a vial of it and spent the next 5 years copying religious tracts in exile. True story, but whether the exile was official or just strongly suggested remains unclear. You might expect the air here to be musty, but no, the Byzantines loved fragrance. They burned incense not only in churches but in meeting rooms. The emperor's reception hall was often perfumed with frankincense and crushed rose petals, to remind visitors they were walking into divinely sanctioned space. Or at least a room where complaints would smell nice. There were also peacocks. Of course there were. The Byzantines had a deep affection for animals that symbolized eternity, beauty, and showing off. Several peacocks lived in the palace gardens, wandering through marble colonnades like entitled employees. Fringe sources say one of them was once granted a ceremonial title, though modern historians suspect that might have been a sarcastic footnote by a disgruntled scribe. The Great Palace was less about comfort and more about theater. Rooms were arranged not just for function, but for effect. Long, narrow vestibules led to sudden bursts of grandeur, domed halls with echoing acoustics, windows designed to capture specific shafts of morning light, and staircases that always seemed to ascend into something just slightly too impressive. Imagine being a foreign ambassador, already terrified, now made to walk down a 100-meter corridor of gold tile while a eunuch recites your name in 6 languages. That's intimidation by architecture. And yet, even inside this imperial labyrinth, work had to happen. A lot of it. Scribes wrote in shifts. Servants swept constantly. Guards rotated posts every hour. One particularly bureaucratic empress had a bell installed in her chamber that rang whenever a petition arrived. It rang every 6 minutes for most of Lent. She stopped answering after day 3. The most surprising thing? For all its ceremonial grandeur, the palace also had spots of mundane weirdness. The imperial latrines, for example, were highly advanced, multi-seat, with plumbing, but apparently had abysmal ventilation. Visiting nobles often left early from dinners just to avoid using them. One Venetian diplomat is said to have brought his own scented handkerchief and politely pretended he was allergic to basil. And if you think it ended with the emperor, think again. His family had wings of the palace. His wardrobe had an entire floor. His personal icon collection had its own guard rotation. And his dinner service? Gold plates, silver ladles, and a set of napkins embroidered with phrases like eternal glory and try not to spill. Okay, maybe not those exact words, but close. Tonight, as you wander through one of the quieter colonnades, you hear a distant echo, a choir rehearsing, maybe. Or just another scribe reading aloud to himself to stay awake. A breeze stirs the curtain at the end of the hall. You follow it and step onto a balcony overlooking the Sea of Marmara. Below, fishing boats drift like forgotten commas in a sentence too long to edit. Above, stars blink between arches. This is where empires pretend to be eternal. And inside, another clerk reaches for his ink pot and begins again. You leave the stars behind and head back inside, into a smaller chamber with a peculiar hum in the air. It's not the sound of voices, or even the usual soft footfalls of servants. No, it's the shimmer of gold being brushed across parchment, the dry rasp of a stylus dragging across a gilded line. Welcome to the gilding room. This is where Byzantine documents went to get dressed for the ball. And by documents, we don't mean birthday cards or thank you notes. We're talking imperial edicts, religious decrees, or those ornate diplomatic letters meant to dazzle the kings of distant lands into not invading for at least another month. Every piece of parchment that passed through this room was handled like sacred scripture, even if it was just an updated shipping schedule for grain shipments across the Aegean. Here, artisans spent hours, sometimes days, applying actual gold to parchment. Not gold-colored paint. Real gold. Hammered into sheets so thin they'd vanish in a sigh, then glued with a mixture of honey, fish glue, and probably equal parts anxiety. The goal? Make words gleam. Make power glisten. And above all, make sure that the person reading the message knew exactly how rich and petty the Byzantine court could be. The documents weren't just written, they were illuminated. Entire borders were decorated with vines, peacocks, crosses, and in one notable case, a very judgmental-looking angel pointing at a tax figure like he couldn't believe you still hadn't paid. And the process? Oh, it was agonizing. A document would be drafted in wax first, reviewed and revised more times than a bad emperor's will, then passed to the guilders. These men, often trained in monasteries or specialized guilds, would apply gold leaf to specific words, usually the emperor's name, key blessings, or the intimidating parts that said things like by the command of the all-ruling, God-anointed, eternally victorious, merciful but not really sovereign of Rome. Subtle, right? Historians still argue whether the excess of gold served more of a diplomatic function, meant to impress foreign powers, or a religious one, connecting the emperor's word with divine light. Either way, the result was scrolls so reflective they could double as impromptu mirrors. Some were so dazzling that messengers had to cover them with cloth until the moment of reading, to preserve the drama. But don't think this level of extra came without complications. Gold is not a forgiving material. It flakes. It warps. It sticks to places you never wanted it to go. One poor gilder in the 11th century allegedly sneezed halfway through applying leaf to a decree for the Prince of Kiev and had to redo the entire section, after spending 3 days apologizing to the paper. And speaking of materials, let's not forget that parchment, vellum, wasn't cheap. It came from calfskin, and the higher the quality, the smoother and whiter it was. A single imperial decree might use the skin of 2 or 3 calves, which made every tiny mistake a costly one. You had to write slow, breathe shallow, and pray the ink dried before your elbow smudged it into oblivion. Fringe tidbit? There are records of a certain monk in Thessaloniki who tried using powdered emerald to make green ink for headings. It looked great, until the humidity turned it into a kind of mint-colored mold that ate half the document. His punishment? Copying the Psalms by candlelight for a year. In Latin. The Byzantine obsession with gilded documents also extended to storage. These scrolls weren't thrown into dusty bins. They were kept in specially lined caskets, often made of wood inlaid with ivory and locked with tiny bronze clasps. Some even had miniature pillows inside, because when you're sending a letter to the Caliph of Baghdad, it simply must arrive well rested. It was all about control. The Byzantines didn't just want to send messages, they wanted to stage performances. When a foreign emissary received one of these shimmering scrolls, he was expected to read it aloud in front of his court, complete with appropriate pauses, emotional inflection, and maybe even a gasp when the emperor's name was announced. Reactions were tracked. Applause was preferred. Confusion tolerated. Laughter? Risky. And sometimes, the documents weren't even meant to be read. A few were so heavily gilded and sealed that opening them destroyed the outer design. This was the Byzantine equivalent of read receipt enabled but unreadable unless you dare break the art. These unread scrolls were symbolic, tokens of status that said, "We sent a letter." It was beautiful. If you open it, it becomes less beautiful. Choose wisely. Of course, all this glitter came with a price. Not just in gold, but in time. Drafting a single scroll from composition to final delivery could take months. By then, whatever political crisis it addressed was usually over, or had spiraled into something worse. But no one seemed to mind. Because in Byzantium, the performance of power was often more important than its timing. Imagine now that you're sitting at a long wooden bench, sheets of vellum laid before you, a fine brush in hand. You dab a little glue, press a square of gold leaf, breathe out slowly, one letter at a time. Behind you, a junior scribe reads your work aloud, double-checking the spelling of Theodosius. You both know that one wrong mark, one wrinkle in the gilding, could mean being reassigned to copying court petitions. In Cappadocia. In winter. The flame flickers. The leaf holds. The letter gleams. And somewhere in a palace across the sea, a sultan or a king will soon unroll this scroll and see it shine, not just with gold, but with the full weight of 1,000 years of tradition, arrogance, and meticulously applied fish glue. You shuffle now into a narrow office with a low ceiling and a window barely wide enough for sunlight to sneak through. The air feels oddly still, like even the dust motes are holding their breath. You're in the archives again, but not the grand, gold leaf kind. This is the cubicle of despair. A desk, a stool, and one very tired man who's been copying the same tax statute since your great-grandmother's great-grandfather was a toddler. Meet the long-haul Byzantine clerk. His pen has more mileage than a merchant galley. The job? Copying laws. Not writing them, copying. Preserving. Redrafting. Backspacing, very slowly, with a knife. Every imperial decree, every property claim, every grain quota from Antioch to Trebizond had to be duplicated by hand. No printers. No typewriters. Just one overworked human, a lamp, a bottle of ink, and a prayer to Saint Notarius, who, if he existed, probably wept constantly. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't exciting. But it was essential. These clerks formed the invisible backbone of the Byzantine state, copying old laws into new codices, clarifying confusing statutes, translating Latin leftovers into court-ready Greek. It could take weeks to transcribe a single volume, Longer if you had to decorate it or were interrupted by, say, an outbreak of plague or a nearby riot. Some clerks copied for decades. One, named Anastasios, reportedly worked from his mid-20s until he died in his 70s, producing over 50 bound tomes of legal commentary, and a small personal collection of margin doodles featuring cats in imperial robes. Fringe sources suggest he became so good at legal shorthand that others had to create a glossary just to decipher his work. He wasn't fired. He was too valuable. But he was also never promoted, because that would mean replacing him. Historians still argue whether this bureaucratic immortality was a mark of honor or just a sign the empire didn't know what to do with old employees. Some believe these long-tenured scribes were revered like relics. Others suspect they were merely forgotten, a fixture of the office like the rusty oil lamp or the creaky chair that nobody dared move. But the system worked, mostly. Until it didn't. Enter the case of Nicetas the Careless. Around the mid-10th century, Nicetas, a mid-level tax clerk in Bithynia, accidentally copied a provincial grain levy onto a sheet reserved for imperial exemptions. The result? A small fishing village was technically classified as a tax-free aristocratic estate. For 15 glorious years, its citizens paid nothing. No tariffs, no census duties, no grain shipments. They even received a stipend meant for monks. By the time anyone noticed, the villagers had built a shrine to Saint Nicetas, patron of clerical errors, and refused to give the land back. It took a full imperial delegation and a minor bribe involving amphorae of olive oil to restore order. And yes, someone had to write the correction. By hand. 3 times. In triplicate. The tools of this trade were deceptively simple. A quill, sharpened with obsessive care. An inkwell, sometimes made of bronze or horn. A small knife to scrape away mistakes, a ruler to keep lines straight, and a sand shaker to help ink dry faster. No keyboards, no Control-Z. You messed up, you scraped and rewrote. If you messed up on purple parchment, you prayed. But here's the thing, sometimes, the monotony led to magic. In the margins of these long documents, you can find little bursts of life. Tiny notes to loved ones. Self-deprecating jokes. One clerk copied a tax law on wool tariffs, then added, "May I never see another sheep again." Another wrote, after transcribing a 200-line inheritance clause, "This law is longer than a Lenten fast and twice as painful." These moments are rare, but real. They remind us that even in the most soul-numbing corners of empire, people were still people. Tired, hungry, probably annoyed at their supervisor, but people. With quirks. With humor. With a quiet resistance to being erased by time. Now picture yourself there, hunched over a parchment, eyes squinting in lamplight, your fingers cramped from an hour of looping the same Greek legalese over and over. You pause. Breathe. Then, on a whim, you sketch a fish with legs in the corner. You smile, just a little. Somewhere, centuries later, a scholar gasps at your rebellion and names it an early medieval metaphor for bureaucratic mutation. You were just bored. And don't underestimate the power of boredom in the Byzantine bureaucracy. It made clerks meticulous. It made them inventive. It also made them dangerous. There's a rumored case of a law being clarified by a scribe who hated his supervisor. His version of the statute subtly shifted tax collection duties away from the palace and onto a rival's estate. No one noticed for months. When they did, the scribe had vanished, reportedly living under an assumed name in Cilicia, where he became a melon farmer. Byzantine documents might sparkle with gold and purple, but behind every line was a human hand, tired, twitchy, probably stained with ink, and definitely underpaid. And without them, the whole imperial machine would grind to a halt. So next time someone tells you bureaucracy is boring, remember, somewhere, a tired clerk once doodled a goat in a crown beside a passage on maritime law, just to see if anyone would notice. No one did. Until now. The air thickens with beeswax and something vaguely metallic as you move down another hall. You hear the soft clunk of metal on stone, repeating, rhythmic, ceremonial. You've arrived at the office of seals, which sounds less exciting than it is, unless you're imagining seals wearing togas and stamping documents with their flippers. Don't worry, that mental image will stay with you. But no, this is the Byzantine art of sealing, and oh, did they seal everything? Letters, laws, orders, invitations to poorly attended banquets. If it came from someone important, it came sealed. Not just shut, but symbolically armored. And those seals? Often made from lead. heavy, purposeful, and full of meaning. These weren't just decorative buttons, they were credentials, shields, signatures, and status symbols all at once. The process was beautifully over the top. A clerk would fold the parchment just so, thread a ribbon or strip of papyrus through pre-cut holes, then press the lead bulla into a specially carved matrix, an engraved mold with the sender's official image or inscription. The matrix would clamp down like a sleepy crocodile, squashing the lead into an eternal shrug of legitimacy. The resulting object? Round, gray, and sometimes terrifying. A coin-sized badge of imperial intent. And yes, imperial seals were a thing. Emperors had their own, often bearing their full title in Greek or Latin, their preferred iconography, crosses, eagles, or, in one weird case, a lamb holding a spear, and usually a few well-chosen threats implied by the fawn alone. These were used for formal communications, diplomatic outreach, and occasionally to intimidate rebellious governors who hadn't written in a while. But not all seals were created equal. Mid-level officials had smaller ones, usually with just a name and a rank. Monasteries had their own, often featuring saints glaring suspiciously at anyone trying to forge a charter. Even military generals carried personal seal rings, which they'd use to stamp wax directly onto short orders, like "Move the cavalry" or "Please stop stealing from the armory." Wax was more common than lead in lower-level correspondence, but if you saw a lead seal, you paid attention. And sometimes, you didn't want to open it. That's because breaking a seal was a big deal. You needed witnesses. You needed ceremony. In some cases, you needed an actual proclamation that you were authorized to open it. Otherwise, it was like reading the emperor's diary without permission. Spoiler, the penalty was rarely just a stern warning. Historians still argue whether seals were mainly for security, symbolism, or bureaucratic theater. Some believe they were a direct line to the imperial ego, a way to leave fingerprints across the empire without ever lifting a quill. Others argue they were practical, making sure documents weren't tampered with en route. And then there's the fringe theory that some seals were made so extravagantly thick just to show off how much lead the sender could afford. Fringe tidbit? There's a record of a bishop in Asia Minor who sent a letter with such a large lead seal that the courier reportedly had to stop halfway through his journey and get a mule just to carry it the rest of the way. The seal survived. The mule did not. Scholars call this the sealed beast incident. Not officially, but they should. Some seals were even color-coded. While the imperial chancery mostly used lead, wax came in shades of red, green, and even black, each color signifying something different. Red for royal, green for religious, black, apparently, for really bad news. Imagine opening a letter with a glossy black seal and realizing halfway through that it's not a party invitation, it's a decree ordering you to give up half your land and go join a monastery in the mountains. Yikes! The collecting of these seals is a whole field now, sigillography, the study of seals. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands, most of them cracked, flattened, or half-melted, but still bearing names like John, humble servant of the patriarch, or Michael, commander of the Western theme. They tell stories the documents no longer can, because parchment burns, but lead? Lead sticks around. Some are tiny works of art. There's one depicting the Virgin Mary with outstretched arms, flanked by stars, her expression a mixture of calm and "I can't believe I have to approve this edict." Another shows a bearded emperor holding a cross in one hand and a model of Constantinople in the other. Real subtle, guys. And some seals were faked. Oh yes, the Byzantines may have loved paperwork, but fraud found its way in. A few clever scribes figured out how to carve counterfeit matrices, simpler than forging a signature, harder to detect. One particularly infamous forgery involved a forged imperial seal granting land to a monastery that didn't exist. The seal was so convincing that it fooled 3 emperors over 2 decades before someone realized the saint had an extra finger. Imagine now that you're holding a sealed scroll. It's warm from your fingers, heavier than expected. The lead disc dangles from its ribbon like a silent judge. You don't know what's inside. It could be a promotion. It could be a summons. It could be a strongly worded theological complaint about your gardening practices. But the seal? That tells you everything. Someone important touched this. Someone with power. Someone who knows your name, or at least your postal district. You take it to the reception chamber. A notary steps forward. He reads the inscription, nods, then calls for witnesses. They watch as he cracks the seal with a firm press of the thumb. The scroll unfurls. the truth is revealed. It's a reminder about tax quotas. Great. And still, you keep the seal. Not because you need it, but because it feels like a token. A weighty little artifact that says, you were noticed. The Empire saw you. Stamped you. Filed you. Forgot you. But the seal still remembers. The room you enter next is eerily quiet, like even the walls are trying to forget what's inside them. Thick tomes line the shelves, some bound in fading leather, others just loose bundles tied with ribbons so old they crumble at the touch. This is where the law sleeps. Or rather, it naps nervously between rewrites. You've arrived at the long shadow of one of the Byzantine Empire's most ambitious legal projects, the Code of Justinian, the Corpus Juris Civilis, a name so heavy it practically dents the table. Imagine this, it's the 6th century. The empire is wobbling. Too many laws, too many contradictions, too many panicked governors writing their own interpretations on the back of fish receipts. Enter Emperor Justinian, ambitious, slightly paranoid, obsessed with order. He decides to fix everything by rewriting Roman law into one grand, glorious, terrifyingly comprehensive package. A little cleanup, right? Just organize things, standardize penalties, maybe reword a few sentences. It turns into a monster. The Corpus Juris Civilis was no ordinary law code. It was a sprawling, 4-part collection that included the digest, a summary of centuries of legal opinions, the code, laws and edicts from previous emperors, the institutes, a kind of law student starter kit, and the novels, new laws Justinian wrote himself, presumably while muttering "you're welcome" under his breath. It tried to cover everything: property, contracts, crime, inheritance, marriage, divorce, guardianship, plumbing regulations, and even some delightfully vague curses about people who cheat on taxes. Historians still argue whether Justinian actually understood how massive a task this would be. Some say he just wanted to show off. Others believe he genuinely wanted to build a legal system that reflected divine order on earth. A few fringe scholars suggest it was an elaborate therapy project to help him cope with childhood trauma involving zoning laws. But here's the real kicker: it kind of worked. The code became the backbone of Byzantine law for centuries. It influenced medieval European law. It resurfaced in the Renaissance. It even wormed its way into modern civil codes used in Germany, France, and, indirectly, by anyone who's ever tried to understand why contract law is so weird. And yet, it was overwhelming. Byzantine students dreaded it. Legal scholars cried over it. Copyists loathed it. One poor monk in Cappadocia is said to have spent 18 years copying the digest by hand, only to accidentally spill oil on the last page and have to start over. He died mid-paragraph, which is probably the most poetic ending a Byzantine lawyer could hope for. The code was not only long, it was rigid. And Byzantine rulers, being both traditional and wildly impulsive, often issued contradictory decrees that technically overrode parts of the code but didn't actually delete anything. So the law turned into this creaking cathedral of yes, but also no, unless it's Thursday. To fix this, emperors issued novels, new laws, usually in Greek, because Latin was rapidly becoming more of a ceremonial flex than a spoken tongue. These novels were tacked onto the existing system like hastily written post-it notes on a sacred scroll. Over time, the pile grew ridiculous. Lawyers had to carry literal boxes of scrolls just to argue a single case about land boundaries. And the ordinary citizen? Forget it. If you were a goat herder in Thrace and got fined for letting your flock graze on church property, you'd be lucky if the judge could even find the law he was supposed to quote. Most just improvise. According to the spirit of the law became Byzantine 4. I'm making this up, but I sound confident. And still, the code kept growing. Monks copied it. Scribes updated it. Judges interpreted it. Sometimes wrongly, often slowly, always with flair. One particularly poetic judge once added an entire paragraph explaining why a baker who stole flour from another baker wasn't guilty, because, he argued, yeast is the breath of God, and no man may claim its origin. The case was overturned, but the paragraph survives. Fringe tidbit? There's a rumored secret annex of the code, known as the Liber Umbri, or Book of Shadow, that supposedly included taboo laws the empire didn't want public. Things about palace scandals, forbidden rituals, or taxes levied on dreams. Most scholars dismiss it as a late medieval hoax. But one cracked scholar insisted he saw a fragment with a law against harboring talking serpents without ecclesiastical license. Make of that what you will. And let's not forget the loopholes. Oh, the Byzantines loved a loophole. So much so that legal experts often made careers just by exploiting ambiguities. A well-placed pause or misread verb tense could change a conviction into a wedding. One noblewoman reportedly used an obscure clause about property succession to legally marry her own cousin's ghost. The bishop protested. The law shrugged. Now imagine you're sitting at a long desk, the digest open before you, its pages cracked and ink flaking. You're searching for a precedent. You've been here for hours. The oil lamp sputters. Somewhere nearby, a clerk mutters curses in Koine Greek. You find the passage. You read it aloud. It says, the seller of a goat must also disclose its mood. You stare at it. The goat stares back. You close the book and take a long walk. The corpus juris civilis wasn't perfect, but it was sturdy. It tried, earnestly, maddeningly, and sometimes hilariously, to make sense of a world that was always shifting. It taught generations to think like lawyers, to parse meaning from contradiction, to see law not as a hammer, but as a labyrinth. And like all good labyrinths, it rarely led to the place you expected. But it was beautiful, in a Byzantine sort of way. You ease open a thick wooden door held together more by habit than hinges, and step into what smells suspiciously like dust, damp wool, and ink that gave up trying to dry sometime around the 11th century. The room is dim and unusually warm, cluttered with shelves that groan beneath towers of scrolls, bound codices, and boxes labeled in looping, nervous handwriting. This is the archive, the real one. Not the ceremonial library with mosaics and lavender-scented candles. This is where information came to die slowly, surrounded by other forgotten things. The Byzantines had a very particular relationship with paperwork. They couldn't let go of it. Ever. Birth records, death decrees, marriage contracts, grain tallies, court transcripts, tax exemptions from governors whose provinces no longer existed, it all ended up here. Piled, stacked, bundled, sealed. They didn't just keep documents. They kept them, like a dragon hoarding very specific and extremely flammable treasure. The system was, technically, an archive, but practically, it was closer to a hoarder's attic run by monks with poor eyesight and a fear of throwing anything away just in case. Most empires burned records when they fell out of use. The Byzantines filed them more deeply. You could find a land deed from the 7th century sandwiched between two completely unrelated sermons from the 10th, with a recipe for pickled turnips scribbled in the margin because parchment was expensive. And the archivists? Oh, the archivists. Imagine the patience of saints mixed with the organizational habits of mildly frantic librarians. These were men who measured their lives not in years, but in how many shelf compartments they filled. They wore brown robes, spoke in low mutters, and often developed an unsettling fondness for filing systems. One even invented a 3-tiered scroll labeling method using different colored threads, red for active, green for historical, and black for touch this and I curse your descendants. Historians still argue whether the Byzantines were just naturally archival or whether the constant threat of political upheaval made everyone want to hold on to proof of their innocence. Either way, the result was astounding. Some of the oldest surviving state documents in history are Byzantine. Decrees, treaties, inventories, all still here, waiting for someone brave and bored enough to decipher them. And let's talk about storage methods. Shelves were built tall but shallow, scroll racks were angled to let the parchment breathe, and dry rooms were rotated seasonally to avoid mold. Fringe tidbit? There's evidence they even used dried rose petals as a kind of primitive humidity control, and possibly to make it slightly less miserable in summer. Still, mold happened. Ink bled. And when one flood in the 9th century damaged a vault of diplomatic scrolls, the cleanup took over 4 years and resulted in at least one nervous breakdown, described in a surviving letter as the trembling of the record keeper, now daily increasing. But maybe the strangest part? Nothing was ever really removed. Even when documents were outdated or void, they weren't destroyed, they were annotated. A red mark might mean superseded, a curled symbol no longer in effect, and occasionally, an angry scribble across the top, revoked by order of the Holy Synod. Which sounds dramatic, until you learn the document in question was about fish barrel size regulations. You might think this hoarding was inefficient, and you'd be right. Occasionally, entire cases were delayed for months simply because no one could locate the right scroll. One judge famously postponed a land dispute for a whole year after claiming the relevant contract had been misfiled beneath the theological letters of Saint Simeon. It had not. It was under a stack of outdated wine tax policies. Close enough. Still, some archivists developed incredible recall abilities. One, named Georgios of the Ink Room, reportedly memorized over 12,000 shelf positions. He became so essential that palace guards were ordered to escort him with gentleness, which in Byzantine terms is about as loving as it gets. And even retirement didn't free you. Elder archivists were often retained as consultants, dragged out of monastic repose to explain why a 40-year-old charter had a fish drawn in the corner instead of a standard seal. Their answers were usually vague, poetic, and somehow always involved the phrase, as was the custom in those days. Imagine being in their shoes. You're old. Your eyes blur at the sight of parchment. Your joints creak louder than the drawers. But someone needs to know why a shipment of cinnamon in 912 was rerouted through Antioch. You sigh, walk slowly down the corridor, turn left at the statue of St. Thecla, and, yes, there it is. Scroll 812G, third drawer, misfiled under fragrant tributes. You pull it out, hand it over, and shuffle back to your chair. You are a god among bureaucrats. Sometimes, you wonder if anyone will ever look at these documents again. If the hours you spent annotating tax exemptions with careful red lines and sarcastic marginalia were worth it. But then a young assistant walks in holding a petition from a farmer in Macedonia, and you recognize the name. His grandfather filed a similar plea 40 years ago. You remember. You find the file. You smile, just a little. Because in this empire, nothing is truly forgotten. It's just misfiled. You're in a supply room now. Not the glamorous kind with silk and ceremonial scepters, but a low, drafty chamber stacked with crates of feathers, barrels of vinegar, and sacks of suspiciously dusty minerals. Welcome to the back end of Byzantine bureaucracy, the place where ink was born, feathers died, and office supplies became an extreme sport. If you thought writing laws was hard, try keeping enough quills around to do it. The humble quill, plucked from the wing of a large bird, usually goose, swan, or, in imperial cases, peacock, was the writing tool of choice. But not just any feather would do. It had to be the fifth primary feather from the left wing, plucked in spring, when the shafts were firm but not brittle. Right wing feathers curled the wrong way for most scribes. Left wing feathers? Goldilocks perfect. Who figured this out? Probably someone very bored and very stabbed with the wrong feather. Feathers had to be dried, trimmed, and hardened in hot sand. Each was then carefully sliced into a nib with a tiny knife called a penknife. Yes, that's where the word comes from. These penknives were prized possessions. A good scribe could spend as long sharpening quills as actually writing with them. If the nib split mid-sentence, you had to stop, repair, and pray you hadn't just splattered vinegar-based ink all over a page of royal decrees. And speaking of ink, it wasn't bought at a store. It was made, mixed, tweaked, argued over. Traditional ink recipes called for soot or lampblack, bound with gum arabic and diluted with vinegar. Additives included gallnuts, wine, honey, powdered metals, and sometimes, fringe tidbit here, crushed lizard tails, allegedly to ward off mold. There is no solid proof this worked, but someone, somewhere, definitely believed in lizard-based preservation. Purple ink, as you already know, was another league entirely. Made from the murex snail, it was stored in tightly sealed jars and rationed like holy oil. Transporting it was risky. If the dye dried out, it became nearly useless. Couriers carrying it were issued damp cloth wrappings, metal tins, and in one recorded case, a formal warning: should the seal be broken or the ink sour, the punishment shall be proportional to the prestige of the document it would have adorned. That's Byzantine 4. Ruin this and you're writing sheep census reports forever. Ink also needed to be stored properly. Glass inkwells were rare and fragile. Most scribes used horn or clay, with lids sealed in wax. Some ink thickened over time, requiring the addition of wine to reliquefy it. Others became too watery and had to be thickened with powdered gum. At any given time, a scribe might have 3 or 4 inkwells at different consistencies just to match parchment type, temperature, and the thickness of the script being copied. And all of this assumed you actually had parchment. Parchment was expensive, made from stretched and scraped calfskin. When supply ran low, scribes resorted to reusing older documents, a process called palimpsesting. They scraped away the original ink and wrote over it. You can still see traces of the original writing under some documents today, ghostly lines beneath imperial orders, like the whispers of older decisions trying to rise back up. Historians still argue whether the empire ever truly had a shortage of writing materials or whether the reuse of parchment was simply economical. But one thing's certain, scribes were under constant pressure to conserve. There are surviving scrolls written so tightly that even the margins are filled with text, the lines curving up the sides like ivy on a wall. One desperate tax decree runs vertically along a page's left edge, right through the decorative border. And when the ink ran out, or went bad, you were expected to improvise. There's a surviving letter where a clerk apologizes for the red ink in his report, explaining, the black had fermented and took on a terrible smell. Which tells you two things: 1, ink could ferment, and 2, someone tried to use it anyway. Then there were the brushes. Yes, brushes. While quills were standard, some scribes preferred thin brushes for decorative headings or gold leaf applications. These were made from squirrel or sable hair and attached to little wooden shafts, usually carved by the scribes themselves. One monastery reportedly hosted an annual brush blessing, where new brushes were sprinkled with holy water and dedicated to the protection of clarity and good grammar. Storage of supplies was a logistical nightmare. Feathers had to be kept dry and away from rodents. Ink ingredients required a controlled climate, no heat, no damp, and absolutely no cats, as they tended to knock over everything. Scribes often kept personal kits, like tool rolls, filled with pen knives, string, wax, seals, extra quills, and in some cases, good luck charms. One surviving toolkit contains a carved wooden charm in the shape of a donkey. Its use? Unknown. Its vibe? Relatable. Now picture yourself back in the clerk's workshop. You're running low on ink. The apprentice dropped a jar of soot last week and now the best you can manage is a watery gray mess that smells like vinegar and crushed raisins. Your quill has a split in the nib, and your penknife's gone dull. You scrape through the last paragraph of a shipping contract, praying the parchment doesn't ripple again from the humidity. You finish the page. It's smudged, slightly slanted, barely readable, but it's done. You sprinkle a pinch of fine sand to dry the ink. You exhale. The document goes into a pile that will be sealed, stored, maybe never opened. But your work, the ink, the feather, the strain, it stays, centuries later, telling a story of not just what the empire did, but how it did it. Because behind every glorious decree was someone in the back room, cursing softly at a defective feather. You've wandered into another writing room now, but something about this one feels different. Less candlelit reverence, more side-eye suspicion. The scribes here sit in pairs, backs tense, quills moving in unison, but too smoothly. You glance at a man hunched over his desk, and he doesn't just look tired, he looks aware. You've entered the darker side of the Byzantine writing world. This is the scriptorium where secrets leaked, spies scribbled, and sometimes, letters weren't written to be read, they were written to be heard by someone who wasn't supposed to know they existed. The Byzantine Empire didn't have a formal intelligence agency. It didn't need one. It had scribes. See, in an empire built on scrolls, it wasn't hard to tuck extra meaning between the lines. Scribes were everywhere, in the chancery, the army, the church, and yes, even in foreign embassies. They copied everything. That meant they saw everything. And if you see enough, eventually, you start telling someone. Some scribes were loyal. Others, strategic. A few were simply bored and realized they could make extra coin by misplacing a scroll or slipping a coded phrase into a routine update. You'd be amazed how much information could be smuggled into a footnote. One clerk supposedly inserted the phrase "the wheat bends northward" into a weather report, a signal to a general waiting across the Bosphorus to begin a coup. Historians still argue whether these embedded messages were common or just the stuff of later Byzantine drama. Some believe the so-called scribe spies were mythologized over time. Others argue that the empire's obsession with surveillance makes it likely many scribes moonlighted as informants, especially the ones working near sensitive communications or imperial correspondence. Either way, the fear was real. You didn't speak too freely in a scriptorium. You didn't leave notes unattended. And you definitely didn't copy imperial orders without double-checking for hidden meaning. One poor monk in a northern outpost once unknowingly reproduced a forged letter authorizing a troop withdrawal. It was fake. His unit evacuated. The enemy walked in. the monk was reassigned to the monastery's compost pile. Permanently. There's even a surviving marginal note from a scribe in the 12th century that reads, "This scroll has too many eyes." No one knows what he meant. Maybe it was poetic. Maybe he knew he was being watched. Maybe he was the watcher. Some scribes developed their own codes, ciphers, invisible ink, steganographic flourishes. Fringe tidbit: a parchment from a minor noble's estate contains what appears to be a love letter written in lemon juice, only visible when gently heated by candle flame. It's addressed to someone called S and includes the line, "The hawk returns at dusk." Romantic? Spy stuff? Honestly, could go either way in Byzantium. The empire also made strategic use of bilingual scribes. Many officials were fluent in Latin, Greek, Armenian, or Arabic, depending on their station. Multilingual scribes could alter translations just enough to change a message's tone or intent. One well-documented incident involved a treaty sent to a northern kingdom where the Greek phrase for equal alliance was subtly mistranslated into benevolent oversight. You can guess how well that went down at the royal dinner table. Then there were the scribes embedded in religious settings. Monasteries weren't just spiritual centers, they were information hubs. Monks copied letters for bishops, edited hagiographies, and processed theological complaints. But they also saw private correspondence, read about political feuds, and sometimes shared what they shouldn't, quietly, in confession, over wine, with the right visitor. You imagine now you're one of these scribes, young, sharp, and fluent in 3 languages. A bishop leans over your shoulder, asking you to make a slight change in a letter, just a word or two, really. Harmless. You hesitate. He places a hand on your shoulder. You understand. The word is changed. A feud deepens. An abbot is demoted. The bishop smiles. What you don't know is that a second copy of the original letter exists. Another scribe made it. He sent it elsewhere. Now both versions circulate, and no one is sure which one's real. Mistrust festers. The emperor orders an inquiry. You pretend you've never held a pen in your life. Not every spy scribe had a dramatic arc. Most just listened, filed mental notes, built slow cases against enemies of their patrons. It was the perfect cover. What better place to observe a system's weaknesses than at the desk where it is maintained? Even the act of reading aloud could be suspect. Letters were often dictated in groups, meaning multiple scribes heard the same message. If one went home and recited it to someone else, who would know? Whispers traveled faster than messengers. And sometimes, all it took to bring down a governor was a single misquoted sentence and a curious eunuch. Fringe scholars point to a document preserved in Mount Athos which appears to contain both a standard land dispute ruling and, embedded in the initial letters of each paragraph, a coded message accusing the landowner of heresy. It took 800 years for anyone to notice. The landowner, long dead, remains convicted only in ghostly epigraphy. In a world that worshipped written words, the Byzantines also feared them. They knew letters could be copied, stolen, altered. They issued laws regulating who could write imperial correspondence. They sealed documents not just to prevent tampering, but to sanctify intent. Breaking a seal was like tearing open a soul. And yet, they couldn't help but write. The bureaucracy demanded it. The religion depended on it. The empire itself was made of scrolls as much as stone. You leave this scriptorium now, a little more wary. Behind you, a scribe dips his quill into the ink, glances over his shoulder, and writes a name that doesn't belong on the page. He pauses, scratches it out, rewrites it. Was it a mistake? Or a message? You move now into a hallway lit by high clerestory windows, their panes casting long shafts of honey-colored light across the marble. The atmosphere changes here, less cramped, less paranoid. This is a space of reverence, but not religious. You've reached the imperial autograph room. Or rather, the chamber where scribes prepared the most prized flourish of all, the emperor's signature. Because in Byzantium, a single name could be more powerful than 1,000 pages of legislation, if it sparkled just right. It wasn't exactly a signature in the modern sense. Byzantine emperors didn't usually sign their names with a casual scrawl or a hurried flourish. No, their autographon, their imperial mark, was a sacred symbol of authority, drafted by court scribes in shimmering gold or silver, under the emperor's strict supervision, sometimes even in his presence. And yes, when the purple ink made its cameo, you knew something serious was about to happen. The most common form was a stylized version of the emperor's name, usually with the Greek cross on either side, often encased in an ornate circular emblem that looked more like a logo than a name. Some added tiny artistic flourishes, stars, vines, or halos around their initials. A few went a little wild. Basil too once signed a decree with an entire monogram shaped like a sword. Subtle. But these weren't just decorative. The imperial signature validated the document. It made it real. Without it, a decree was just a well-written suggestion. With it, it became law, gospel, or sometimes a death sentence. There's a recorded case of a land grant document that circulated for years without being enforced, simply because the gold autograph at the bottom was smudged. Local governors refused to obey it, citing lack of luster as a legal excuse. Byzantine problems require Byzantine reasoning. Creating the signature wasn't a one-man job. It involved a dedicated scribe known as the Chartularios II Canicleu, keeper of the imperial inkstand. His job? Maintain the sacred ink, prepare the signature space, and physically inscribe the emperor's name using the designated colors, pressures, and flourishes. Historians still argue whether the emperor ever signed documents by his own hand or merely oversaw the process with a well-practiced frown. There were levels to it, of course. For routine documents, a gold ink monogram might suffice. For treaties, imperial marriages, or church appointments, a full purple signature, complete with seals, invocations, and enough curlicues to make your wrist ache, was required. These were often applied with a reed pen rather than a feather quill, to achieve smoother curves. The ink? A special formula combining gold dust with gum and vinegar, and applied with a sigh of ceremonial pomp. Fringe tidbit? One scribe's notes reveal that on high holy days, the ink was also scented with lavender or rose oil, so that the very act of unrolling the scroll became a multisensory event. Because what's the point of declaring a war if the enemy can't smell how expensive your signature was? The autograph was often accompanied by imperial epithets: Basilius Romaean, Emperor of the Romans, Porphyrogenitos, born in the purple, autocrator, or, in some rare and poetic moments, the Lord's chosen shadow. No, really. The Byzantines didn't do modesty. Over time, the signature evolved. Earlier emperors preferred bold, clear lettering. Later rulers got fancy. One 13th century emperor used a calligraphic style so elaborate that his name looked like it had been tangled in a fishing net. His scribes begged him to simplify. He refused. He said it was divinely unreadable. And that, dear listener, is the most Byzantine sentence ever uttered. But there was danger in this pageantry too. Because when power rests in a single gilded signature, forgers take notice. Forging the imperial autograph was treason, of course, but that didn't stop anyone. There are reports of monasteries bribing local scribes to produce emperor-blessed land grants. One noble family reportedly maintained a private ink workshop to simulate imperial colors. They were caught after a bishop noticed the purple ink smelled strongly of plums, a shortcut that cost them 3 estates and one slightly embarrassed uncle. Still, real or not, the imperial autograph held enormous symbolic weight. Even after death, an emperor's signature could be used to justify policies, settle disputes, or seal off inconvenient inquiries. One empress allegedly kept a forged copy of her late husband's signature to legitimize her regency. No one dared question it, because it shimmered just enough to be plausible. And beyond the political uses, there was something almost spiritual about it. The emperor wasn't just a ruler, he was believed to be appointed by God. His signature wasn't just ink, it was a trace of divine will, a glowing echo of celestial order made visible on vellum. That's why some priests kissed imperial documents during liturgies. That's why some generals carried them into battle. That's why one poor monk kept a signed tax exemption under his pillow for 30 years. When he died, he was buried with it, in a lead box, labeled "Do Not Open." Imagine now that you are the Chartularios. You stand beside the emperor, scroll unfurled, quill in hand. The ink has been stirred. The parchment is primed. The court watches in silence. The emperor nods. You lower your pen, and with one fluid motion, you write his name, not just as a word, but as a weapon, a hymn, a symbol that will travel farther than armies. When you finish, you set the scroll aside. A eunuch rolls it carefully. A servant lights incense. The ink gleams. The moment passes. But the name? It remains. You're led now into a cooler, darker room, almost cave-like, the only light coming from small oil lamps flickering on narrow shelves. The air hums faintly, not with voices, but with memory. Scrolls here aren't ordinary. They shimmer faintly in the gloom. You approach one, and the ink on its surface seems to glow, just a little, like candlelight trapped on the page. Welcome to the strange and rarely discussed world of Byzantine luminous ink. Yes, ink that glows. Because of course the Byzantines wouldn't stop at gold. They wanted scrolls that looked like holy relics in the dark. This wasn't standard protocol. You wouldn't find glowing ink on shipping manifests or goat census reports. This was used sparingly, ceremonially, and almost mystically, reserved for sacred texts, high-level theological declarations, or scrolls meant to be read in dimly lit chapels where the glow added drama and reverence in equal measure. If you were lucky, or unlucky, enough to handle one of these, you knew the message wasn't just important. It was divine. Or dangerous. The glow came from a blend of chemical trickery and pious obsession. Most formulas were closely guarded, but some have survived. One mixture combined crushed fireflies, yes, actual beetles, with phosphorescent minerals like calcium sulfide, suspended in oil or vinegar and mixed with standard carbon ink. The result? A faintly radiant script that shimmered in low light. Not enough to read in total darkness, but just enough to make a monk's jaw drop mid-vespers. Historians still argue whether these inks were functional, symbolic, or just another case of the empire flexing its weirdest muscles. Some believe they were used during specific night services or processions. Others say they were tools of psychological warfare, letters meant to be opened in the dark and read by torchlight, their contents glowing ominously. A few fringe theorists even propose that glowing ink was used to mark cursed letters, though that's more folklore than footnote. One surviving document, a fragment of a homily from the 10th century, includes margins that still show faint phosphorescence when exposed to heat. It was found stored inside a bronze tube, next to a warning, to be read only at the vigil hour. No one knows what the message said. It's been lost to time, damaged by damp and centuries of curious fingers. And this wasn't the only exotic ink in the Byzantine arsenal. There were others, too, inks that changed color when exposed to air, inks that resisted fading even in direct sunlight, inks scented with myrrh or cloves, so that even the act of unfolding a scroll became a sensory ritual. You weren't just reading. You were experiencing imperial communication, layered in light, scent, and shimmer. Creating luminous ink was a pain. It had to be made fresh. Its glow faded over weeks, sometimes days, depending on the ingredients and conditions. That meant timing was everything. A decree written in glowing for a midnight feast couldn't be composed a week early. It had to be done just hours before, dried carefully by hand, then sealed with care to preserve the effect. The pressure on scribes was enormous. One recorded incident tells of a monk who failed to deliver a glowing gospel in time for Easter Vigil. The punishment? Not physical, but emotional. He was assigned to copy psalms about shame and failure. For a year. The glowing ink also had a reputation, mysterious, otherworldly. Some believed it could only be used by scribes who had undergone ritual purification. Others claimed that improper handling of the ink could lead to hallucinations, or that reading too long by its light invited the attention of, well, no one would say exactly what. Just unwanted notice. Make of that what you will. And then there's the political use. A few imperial letters sent to rival courts were written using faintly glowing script, not enough to seem magical, but enough to impress. One surviving missive to the Emir of Aleppo opens with a shimmering salutation, followed by a standard trade negotiation. The message? Byzantium is holy and fabulous. Respect both. Fringe tidbit? There's a dubious but delightful story about a scroll sent to a rebellious governor that glowed when unrolled and, when read aloud, caused the lamps in the room to flicker. The governor allegedly dropped to his knees and submitted. More likely, he slipped, panicked, and the story got better with every retelling. Imagine, now, you're a scribe entrusted with a midnight commission. You've been fasting all day, your hands washed in rose water, your tools laid out like surgical instruments. The ink glows softly in its shallow dish, a mix of beetle extract and crushed minerals. You dip your quill, heart pounding, and begin to write. Slowly, carefully. The letters emerge like stars across a night sky. You've written 100 scrolls before, but this one? This one hums. When you finish, you hold it up. The ink dances faintly under the lamplight. You seal it, double wrap it in silk, and pass it to the messenger. He bows, slips out into the cold night, and rides eastward toward a distant monastery, or maybe a battlefield, or a throne room. And you? You return to your desk, clean your tools, and whisper a quick prayer, not for the message, but that no one ever asks you to make another batch. Beetles don't come cheap in December. The ink fades, eventually. The scroll is read, or lost, or tucked into a chest where no one dares open it again. But sometimes, just sometimes, someone finds it. In the dark, and the letters flicker, ever so faintly, like a memory refusing to sleep. You shuffle forward into a quieter chamber now, one that feels slightly chaotic in a deeply personal way. There are documents scattered across desks, but not in neat stacks. Some are folded hastily, others half-rolled, a few covered in doodles or little phrases scratched in the margins. A sleepy cat dozes on a stool in the corner. Welcome to the edges of the Byzantine administrative mind, literally. These are the margins. And they're alive. When we picture ancient manuscripts, we tend to imagine perfect calligraphy, gilded icons, and squeaky clean parchment. But the truth? Scribes were human. And humans, especially bored ones, tend to draw. Or comment. Or complain. The margins of Byzantine documents are filled with traces of their makers, sarcastic side notes, tiny cartoons, cryptic curses, and occasionally, the literary equivalent of a sigh. One famous example comes from a tax scroll in the 11th century. In the corner, beneath a long and confusing list of grain quantities, a clerk has scrawled, "May the mice eat the one who devised this quota." The handwriting is elegant. The sentiment? Timeless. Marginalia, those little scribbles in the white space, offer a rare peek behind the bureaucratic curtain. They tell us how scribes felt about their work, about their superiors, and sometimes about life in general. And no, these weren't official notes. These were the things no one was supposed to read. But everyone did. Some of it was funny. You'll find little sketches of saints looking annoyed, horses with big teeth, angels doing handstands, monks playing lutes, and in one particularly delightful manuscript, a snail wearing a crown facing off with a knight who looks visibly confused. These weren't illustrations for the reader. They were doodles for the soul. But not all margins were light-hearted. Some bore tiny prayers. Notes like, "Lord, grant me sleep or my back aches, still 20 pages to go." One exhausted scribe wrote, "I hate this parchment" in Latin, Greek, and Coptic, just to cover all bases. A multi-language tantrum. We've all been there. Historians still argue whether scribes were punished for this behavior. Some believe the margins were ignored unless they included profanity or heresy. Others think certain supervisors actively encouraged a little marginal venting as a mental pressure valve. After all, a stressed-out scribe made more mistakes. And mistakes meant scraping parchment. And scraping parchment was basically the medieval equivalent of reformatting your hard drive with a rock. Fringe tidbit? In one monastery, a rule was posted above the scriptorium door: "Let no idle hand wander from the word, save to give glory, or a goat with wings." No one knows exactly what that means. But there are 3 surviving manuscripts from that monastery, each featuring a winged goat. The margins also became places for commentary. Not official glosses, but whispered interpretations. A scribe might write, "I think this law is unfair," next to a clause about land rights. Another might copy a quote from scripture next to a list of fines, as if to suggest divine disapproval. These weren't footnotes. These were side-eyes in ink. And then there were the curses. Oh, yes. When you spend weeks on a scroll, and someone else borrows it, copies it badly, or, worst of all, loses it, you're going to say something. In ink. Forever. One particularly irritated scribe left this gem in a margin: "Whoever removes this scroll shall feel the wrath of the Archangel Michael's toenails." Graphic. Oddly specific. Deeply Byzantine. Some curses were protective, meant to ward off theft. Others were personal. One short line, barely legible, reads, "He promised to return my ink knife. He lied." We'll never know who he was. But somewhere, a friendship ended over stationery. And sometimes, the margins weren't complaints, they were confessions. A 12th century parchment includes a tiny heart drawn beside the name Maria. The same name appears 5 pages later, this time underlined in red. Was it love? Obsession? A very boring saint? No one knows. But it lingers. There's a tenderness to it, really. The margins show us the human side of empire, not the golden thrones. not the sweeping decrees, but the sighs, jokes, longings, and petty gripes of the people holding the pen. People who worked long hours by bad candlelight. People who had favorite saints and secret crushes in terrible handwriting days. People who, despite everything, still found time to draw a cat with a halo on a shipping invoice. Now picture yourself hunched over a desk. You've copied the same royal edict 3 times. Your ink has dried, your quill is dull, and your spine feels like it's folded into thirds. You glance at the margin. Empty. Inviting. You dip your pen. One quick swirl. A snail. A helmet. You add a sword for flair. You smile. The empire continues. The scroll is rolled. The seal is pressed. But in the quiet spaces, between the law and the logic, your snail rides into battle forever. You're walking down a corridor lined with wooden cubbies, each filled with scrolls tied in different colors of string, red for decrees, green for land disputes, blue for ecclesiastical matters, and black for the ones no one wanted to touch. This is the complaints chamber. Not where the emperor heard grievances personally, he was far too busy pretending not to hear them. This is where the average Byzantine citizen, noble, monk, or bureaucrat came to file a complaint, and immediately regret it. Byzantium loved rules. But it didn't necessarily love fairness. That's where the petition system came in. In theory, anyone could submit a formal complaint to the emperor or his advisors. You wrote your grievance on parchment or papyrus, addressed it with the proper titles and groveling, and sealed it with whatever authority you had, often just your name and a desperate hope. Then you handed it to an official known as a decaticos or petition reader. That's when the waiting began. And waiting. And waiting. Sometimes for months. Occasionally for years. One peasant famously submitted a complaint about a neighbor stealing his sheep. The response arrived 2 decades later. By then, both men were dead, and the sheep had probably been reincarnated into a judge's winter coat. Submitting a complaint was a gamble. It marked you publicly. It meant you were unhappy, which was suspicious. It meant you wanted change, which was borderline rebellious. Even the way you phrased your petition mattered. Too aggressive? It was seditious. Too meek? Dismissed. The sweet spot lay somewhere between tearful loyalty and theatrical despair. Historians still argue whether this system was meant to help people or just make them feel like they might be heard. There are cases where complaints led to reforms, overturned taxes, returned land, punishment for corrupt officials. But more often, they ended in silence, redirection, or a mysterious increase in property inspections. A few unlucky petitioners found themselves invited to monasteries in remote mountain regions for extended reflection. You weren't exiled, just relocated. Spiritually. Fringe tidbit? In one preserved petition, the writer complains not about taxes, property, or grain shortages, but about his neighbor's donkey, who reportedly stared into his window with malicious intent. The letter is long. Emotional. The response, scrawled at the bottom by a palace official, by curtains. If your complaint did make it through, it was usually read aloud in a small review room where low-ranking clerks would judge its merit before forwarding it up the bureaucratic ladder. Most were rejected at this stage, often for reasons like improper format, unclear handwriting, or too many metaphors. Byzantine bureaucracy wasn't interested in poetry. But occasionally, a grievance struck a chord. A merchant's plea about unfair port tariffs. A widow's lament about her son's conscription. A monk's protest about encroaching tax collectors. These might earn a hearing with a logothete, a high-ranking official who could issue corrections, fines, or legal orders. And in truly rare cases, the emperor himself might read the petition. Not that this guaranteed sympathy. One emperor reportedly laughed out loud at a complaint that began with "Oh my golden lord," whose words are more radiant than the sun. He had the writer promoted, not because the complaint was valid, but because he liked the flattery. The actual issue, something about irrigation canals, was never resolved. And let's not forget the complaint formats. Some petitions were standard prose. Others were written as poems, psalms, even legal riddles. One farmer submitted his in the form of a parable involving goats, angels, and a dishonest wheat merchant. The court had to convene a special panel just to figure out what he was actually asking for. Turns out, lower grain taxes. As always. Then there were the professional petitioners. People who submitted grievances constantly, sometimes daily, on behalf of others or just for fun. The court nicknamed them scroll beggars. Some were tolerated. Others were blacklisted. One man submitted complaints under 14 different names. He was caught when he forgot to change his handwriting. His punishment? He was given an official job in the petition office. A fate some scholars describe as administrative irony. If all else failed, some people resorted to dramatic gestures. Standing outside the palace gates in torn robes. Fasting publicly while holding a scroll. One woman reportedly sang her petition aloud in the streets for 3 days before being arrested. Her complaint? A corrupt governor who seized her olive grove. The result? The grove was returned. And she got a job in the palace laundry. Byzantium loved a good performance. Imagine now that you're standing in the outer court of the palace, your complaint scroll in hand. You've written it carefully, your Greek formal but not too pompous. You bow low as you hand it to the gate clerk. He doesn't even look at it, just tosses it into a basket with 100 others. You wait. A week passes. Then a month. You hear nothing. Then one day, a rider arrives. A sealed letter. Inside, a ruling. Your tax burden has been lightened. Your neighbor has been fined. The system worked. Or did it? You'll never know whether it was your words, a sympathetic clerk, or a board official trying to fill a quota. But the scroll was read. The seal was pressed. A change, however small, was made. And in Byzantium, that was nothing short of a miracle. Now you enter a room unlike the others, not because it's grander, or darker, or more gilded, but because it feels heartbreakingly ordinary. The air smells like dust and old parchment, but there's something else here too, something softer. Paperwork, yes, but next to it, tucked between ledgers and tax rolls, are poems. Little verses. Scribbled confessions. And occasionally, a dried flower pressed into the margins. This is the ledger room. But it's not just numbers. It's numbers wrapped in stories. Here, Byzantine tax officials compiled data on everything: grain, livestock, property boundaries, market fees, head counts, and temple offerings. But they didn't always do it with the coldness you'd expect from state accountants. No, sometimes, they did it with flair. Because when you spend your life copying figures in triplicate, eventually you start writing other things, too. Love poems. Laments. Jokes. Odes to pigeons. It happens. Each district submitted regular updates to the imperial fisc, the Byzantine treasury, and these were meticulously reviewed, annotated, and filed. But buried among the expected entries, 12 goats, 3 bushels of barley, 1 fine for unpaid incense, you occasionally find something surprising. A note. A drawing. A heart. One of the most touching fragments comes from a ledger in Cappadocia, dated to the late 10th century. A tax clerk calculating the annual yield for his region suddenly pauses in mid-column and writes, in careful minuscule Greek, "Today, Maria did not return my smile. I have counted every sheep but not the reason." The next line? Back to normal. 36 bales, assessed at 3 numismata each. Was he reprimanded? Did anyone notice? No one can say. But the fact that this quiet little heartbreak survived 9 centuries in the corner of a tax document feels like a miracle in itself. Fringe tidbit? There's a preserved tax ledger from Thessaloniki that includes a complete, 5-verse love poem hidden between entries on wine tariffs. The poem is about a woman with eyes like inkpots, and a heart sealed like an imperial scroll. Historians still debate whether this was metaphor or actual workplace crush documentation. Either way, someone risked a reprimand to immortalize a moment. But let's not pretend the ledgers were all romance and sentiment. They were also teeth-grittingly detailed. One entry logs how many beehives were destroyed in a storm. Another lists a fine against a monk who failed to produce the agreed cheese quota. There's even a notation about a goose confiscated in error and returned with a note. Goose now refuses to eat, possibly cursed. Accountants had a tough job. They were expected to tally, correct, and audit under constant suspicion. If your numbers were too low, you were hiding wealth. Too high? You were inventing numbers. And mistakes weren't just embarrassing, they could be fatal. One infamous clerk misreported grain yields for a province suffering famine. The emperor believed the figures, withheld aid, and the fallout led to riots. The clerk vanished. His replacement? A monk with perfect handwriting and, one assumes, very low blood pressure. Still, creativity found its way in. In areas where literacy was high, tax collectors developed pictographic ledgers. Instead of writing 3 cows, they'd draw 3 cows. Not good drawings, just vaguely mammalian lumps with legs. These visual records were often more accurate than the text-based ones. One pictograph ledger includes a very confused drawing of a 2-headed goat. The scribe added a note. This is what he claimed. I simply recorded it. Some accountants use color-coded inks to track debt, black for settled, red for overdue, gold for exempt. Others developed personal shorthand, mixing Greek letters with made-up symbols. One page from a treasury log includes a column of angry faces next to unpaid entries. Another includes small birds perched on the names of compliant taxpayers. Whether these were visual reminders or just an attempt to stay sane, well, you can guess. And the emotional notes weren't just about love. Some were just pure burnout. One line reads, "This ledger is longer than a bishop's sermon and twice as boring." Another, "If I die here, bury me with the cheese receipts." You get the sense that these people, trapped between numbers and imperial pressure, needed the margins the way we need coffee, not optional, but deeply spiritual. Now picture yourself here. It's late. You've just finished calculating sheep taxes for 3 villages. Your wrist aches. Your ink is drying too fast. You dip your pen again, pause, and scrawl a line in the margin, "I miss the sea." Then you go back to writing, 4 denarii for damaged cart axle, 2 for broken urn. The scroll rolls forward. The day rolls on. Somewhere down the centuries, a historian reads your line and smiles. And maybe, just maybe, that's the best kind of immortality. Because for all its grandeur, Byzantium was built on paper. And behind every calculation, every livestock count and tax column, was a person, tired, poetic, quietly rebellious, leaving behind not just data, but dreams. You step now into a chamber that feels less like a room and more like a nervous idea given architectural form. Tall cabinets line the walls. Strange tools hang from hooks. Parchments are scattered across tables alongside what appear to be measuring ropes, bead counters, and several half-eaten figs. Welcome to the Byzantine Census Office, where brave souls tried to count things that never wanted to be counted, using methods that often made everyone wish they hadn't bothered. The Byzantine census was ambitious. It aimed to record people, property, animals, debts, professions, religious affiliations, and yes, even sins. That's not an exaggeration. Some versions of the population register included notations about moral behavior. Were you a good citizen? Did you owe penance? Were you behind on tithes? These weren't just civil records, they were spiritual audits with a touch of tax anxiety. Conducting a census required trained assessors, epoptai, who traveled to villages, interviewed households, and compiled data on parchment or wax tablets. They had to ask awkward questions. How many goats? How many children? How many acres? Are they productive? Have you sinned lately? Have your goats sinned lately? You get the idea. And people didn't always cooperate. Farmers hid animals. Families underreported children to avoid education fees. One village famously claimed to have been visited by an angel who told them they were exempt from census duties. The official, to his credit, recorded the statement, added a line that read "angelic exemption not recognized by imperial law," and moved on. Historians still argue about the reliability of these censuses. Some suggest the records were remarkably detailed, at least for certain regions. Others point out wild inconsistencies, like the one town that listed 200 men named Iowans, or the island that somehow had more cows than residents. A few suggest census takers sometimes inflated numbers to show they were doing their job. Others suspect local officials deflated figures to reduce their own quotas. Everyone, it seems, had a reason to lie. And the tools? Delightfully improvised. Strings tied in knots for head counts, pebbles sorted into baskets for livestock, wax tablets etched with quick tallies, often erased and rewritten mid-survey. One preserved census tablet includes tally marks for oxen followed by a note, 2 escaped during questioning. You have to wonder how exactly they phrased that part of the interview. Fringe tidbit? A 9th century manual for census takers includes the instruction, if the household will not open the door, wait patiently. If they open the door and throw grain at you, record this under temperament. Yes, they had a column for temperament. And just when you thought it couldn't get messier, enter the practicum. These were formal land registration documents used in tandem with the census to record property ownership, boundaries, and productivity. But they weren't always maps. Sometimes they were vague sketches. One practicant simply describes a field as north of the fig tree, near the rock shaped like a lion, but not the angry lion. Clarifying. Disputes were common. Families argued over whose goat grazed where. Siblings disagreed about inheritance. Monks claimed exemptions. Villages tried to swap borders. One town tried to pass off a fishing pond as a holy site to avoid taxation. The state was not amused. The pond was fined. And then there were the sins. Yes, some versions of the census were compiled by church officials alongside civil ones. In these cases, not only your assets but your moral record was tallied. Had you attended Mass? Confessed? Paid your alms? Missed Lent 3 years in a row? That might cost you a favor in the next tax reassessment. Now imagine being the poor census scribe responsible for copying these tallies into scrolls. Your records are chaotic. Your ink is smudged. One entry just says man with hat owns land near tree. Another lists 5 chickens, maybe 6, ran off. You try to make sense of it all. You align the columns, add knee headers, and label it Census of the Province of Obsikian, Year of Our Lord 944. It's not perfect, but it's done. Until someone walks in holding a second version of the census, with different numbers, and 3 extra goats. So what happened when censuses contradicted each other? Usually, they were averaged, or ignored, or added to the archive under the heading Uncertain Figures, see Miracle of St. Demetrios. Because if all else fails, blame a saint. Byzantine censuses were less about absolute truth and more about the appearance of control. They were a performance of order, a dance of categories in a world where goats refused to be categorized. But still, they mattered. They helped determine taxes, military obligations, urban planning, even marriage arrangements, in a few cases, where population pressure influenced dowries. And sometimes, census records gave people a voice. There's a preserved entry listing a widow named Anna who refused to remarry, declaring, "My field is enough. I require no husband." The assessor added, "Field inspected. Yield, satisfactory." These are the quiet victories hidden in dusty ledgers. Little moments of resistance, pride, or honesty preserved under layers of ink and error. Because for every mismatched number or miraculous goat, there was also someone, somewhere, trying to tell the truth. You leave the room now, stepping past a final table where a scribe is hunched over a list. His handwriting is careful, tired. He murmurs the names as he copies them. He pauses. Then, in the margin, he writes, "Too many people. Not enough parchment." He dips his pen again and continues. And somewhere, the empire breathes a little deeper, believing, just for a moment, that everything has been counted. The hallway turns unexpectedly, narrowing, darkening, and suddenly you're there, the scorched heart of imperial memory. The air here smells of ash, of something ancient that once burned with meaning. What you see is not the echo of ceremony or the flicker of gold leaf. It's ruin. Charred beams. Blackened scroll tubes. Melted wax pooling like ancient tears. You've arrived at the aftermath of one of Byzantium's quietest disasters, the archive fire. There wasn't just one. The empire endured many fires. Some small, some devastating. But one in particular, around the late 11th century, tore through part of Constantinople's central archive, destroying centuries of administrative records, legal documentation, and what some claimed were original decrees dating back to Justinian himself. Officially, it was lightning. Unofficially, sabotage. Probably. Maybe. Nobody knows. Welcome to Byzantine record keeping. The room that burned was part of a larger administrative complex, tucked behind the August Ion Square, not far from Hagia Sophia. The fire moved fast, fed by wax-sealed scrolls, oiled parchments, wooden shelves, and decades of bureaucratic dryness. The flames consumed everything: census reports, tax ledgers, imperial orders, and possibly a few personal notes no one was meant to see. When it was over, officials arrived in full panic mode. Monks were summoned to bless the rubble. Scribes were tasked with recovering legible fragments. And a committee, because of course there was a committee, was appointed to assess the damage, assign blame, and write a new report documenting the loss of the old reports. Historians still argue whether this fire was an accident or something more sinister. One theory suggests a disgruntled scribe started it after being demoted to copying military rations. Another blames a factional struggle between rival bureaucratic families, each eager to erase the paper trail of forged decrees and bribes. A third theory? Faulty oil lamps and some really dry scrolls. The truth, as always in Byzantium, is probably a mix of bad luck, bad wiring, and bad politics. Fringe tidbit? A surviving letter from a palace official mentions the fire only in passing, saying, "The records have gone up like the incense of St. Basil, may the saints forgive our negligence." That's the most poetic way to describe a bureaucratic apocalypse. The real tragedy wasn't just the loss of numbers. It was the collapse of continuity. Land deeds gone. Family claims erased. Legal precedents vanished in smoke. One aristocratic household spent the next 20 years trying to prove they owned a vineyard that had been in the family for 4 generations. The state, lacking paperwork, confiscated it. The family retaliated by producing a forged document featuring a seal that, while quite beautiful, depicted the emperor holding a mango. No one believed it, but the illustration was preserved in a monastery, where it's still admired today. In the fire's wake, there was chaos. Local officials began submitting new versions of old records. Some used it as an opportunity to correct past data. Others tried to insert favorable updates, changing tax rates, boundaries, or titles. One low-ranking military officer emerged from the ashes with a freshly minted scroll declaring him governor of a province he'd never visited. It worked, for 6 months. To rebuild the archive, the empire did what it always did, it copied. Or tried to. Letters were sent to provincial governors requesting duplicates of past reports. Monasteries opened their libraries. Retired scribes were recalled. A few even tried to piece together legal codes from memory. One particularly confident man claimed he could rewrite the Nomos Rhodia Nautikos, a Byzantine maritime law code, from scratch. He submitted 3 pages. 2 were poetry. 1 was a fish recipe. Still, they managed to restore much of it. Not perfectly. Not neatly, but enough to function. Enough to pretend the fire hadn't carved a hole in the empire's paper soul. And in some places, that chaos created unexpected benefits. A few villages seized the moment to erase debts. Some monks claimed their tax obligations had been lost in the fire. One scribe used the opportunity to reclassify a tavern as a church, just for the exemption. The tavern kept serving wine. It was renamed the Blessed Chalice. Of course, not everyone found loopholes. For many, the loss was devastating. Poor farmers who relied on land grants could no longer prove their rights. Widows were denied inheritances. Priests found church titles under review. Even the dead were affected. Burial records lost, tomb ownerships challenged, relics misplaced. One nobleman's remains were dug up, reburied, and dug up again after 3 different families claimed the tomb as theirs. And then there was the imperial reaction. A formal decree was issued, blaming the unpredictability of fire and the failure of men. A new policy mandated multiple copies of all important documents, with backups stored in different districts. Some were even sent to island monasteries to ensure their safety from the flames of error and the winds of ambition. Whether that worked is questionable. One island archive was later raided by pirates, who used the scrolls as cooking fuel. Yet something strange happened in the aftermath. The fire gave Byzantium a renewed sense of urgency. Scribes became more careful. Archives were better organized, at least for a while. Some departments even started using fire-resistant clay containers for especially valuable records. For a few decades, record-keeping entered a golden age. Until people got bored, or lazy, or distracted by another civil war. You walk now through the ghost of that archive. The ashes are long gone, but the absence still lingers. A missing shelf, an empty drawer, a gap in the lineage. Somewhere, a scroll that might have changed everything smoldered into nothing. And still, the empire marched on. It rewrote, reorganized, resigned. Because for every fire, there was always a scribe, sitting at a desk, dipping a pen into ink, and beginning again. Now you reach the end, not just of a corridor or a chamber, but of something greater. You stand at a small wooden desk in a tower that smells of ink, beeswax, and the salt-kissed wind that drifts through a narrow window. The city below crackles with tension. You hear distant shouting, the sound of boots on stone, the low, steady toll of bells. This is 1453. The Ottomans are at the gates. And here, in a quiet corner of the imperial chancery, the last scribe of Constantinople is still writing. While soldiers prepare for the end, and priests pray in half-whispers, one man sits with his quill, ink thick and slow, copying a decree that no one will ever read. Not because he believes it will make a difference, but because that's what he's always done. The habit of empire is hard to break. He isn't copying a call to arms, not a rousing speech or a holy proclamation. He's transcribing a list of bakery licenses. He pauses, reads over the first line, then, with a small breath, scratches it out. Begins again, not because it matters, but because it has to be done properly. Outside, the last emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, is preparing to fight. Inside, the last of the scribes sharpens his quill one final time. Historians still argue whether the chancery remained functional in the final days. Some believe it had already ceased operations. Others insist that a skeleton crew of officials, mostly scribes and clerks too stubborn to stop, kept copying, sorting, sealing. That they filed away orders even as the city fell. Because the empire wasn't just walls and armies. It was routine. It was ink. Fringe tidbit? A single sheet of parchment dated May 28th, the night before the city fell, survives in the archives of Mount Athos. It contains an order to inspect grain stores, signed by a minor court official. Nothing about the siege. No mention of doom. Just a note about bread. Either he didn't know, or didn't want to admit what was coming. And maybe that's the most Byzantine thing of all, the refusal to stop writing, even as history crashes down around you. What happened to that last scribe? We don't know. Perhaps he dropped his pen and fled. Perhaps he was captured. Perhaps, poetically, impossibly, he kept writing until the door was broken down and the ink ran dry on its own. You imagine him now. The lamps have gone out. The candles sputter. But his scroll isn't finished. His handwriting, always neat, always slightly curt, dips at the end. Maybe his hand trembled. Maybe he heard a cry in the street. Maybe he looked out the window and saw the banner rising on the Hagia Sophia. But for just a few more seconds, he wrote. Because someone had to. And when it was done, he rolled the scroll, sealed it with the last of the wax, placed it gently in the drawer, closed it. No ceremony. No glory. Just the quiet act of finishing something in the face of everything. That's how Byzantium ends, not with trumpets or angels or thunderous epics, but with a man in a dusty room, putting a scroll away. Because even in the final moment, the empire remembered itself. And that memory, pressed into ink and parchment, survives. And now, the scrolls are still. The wax seals cool beneath soft shadows. The ink dries slowly, the words fading just slightly into the gentle yellow of aged parchment. You lean back now, the echo of scribes, monks, and emperors slipping quietly into the corners of your mind, like sunlight behind a curtain. Let the sound of quills fade to a hush. The empire has passed, but its paper trail lingers, curled and warm, resting in forgotten drawers and monastery walls, in letters no one opens, in prayers never fully erased. It was an empire of rituals, of records, of rhythm, of purple ink and golden flourishes, of mistakes, doodles, and whispered truths written into the margins. So many margins. And yet, somehow, behind every law, behind every decree, there was a person. A hand. A sigh. A note. A name. Maybe you picture them now, a tired clerk dipping his pen into ink by lamplight. A widow folding her petition with trembling fingers. A young scribe scratching a heart into a tax record, hoping no one will notice. The empire is gone, but they remain. Their words are still here, if you know how to listen. So let your breath slow. Let your thoughts soften. Let the distant clatter of scrolls and seals drift far, far away. You've walked through the ink-stained corridors of a forgotten world. You don't have to remember it all. Just sleep,